My daughter-in-law whispered to my son, "She's old and useless. Just change the title and get rid of her." I never confronted her. I sold the house while they drank champagne in Rome with my money. When they came home, they found a U-Haul and strangers on the porch. But let me tell you how it really started, because the truth is always more complicated than people think. I was watering my rose garden that Tuesday morning in June when I heard Jessica's voice drift through the open kitchen window. She was talking to my son David in that hushed tone she used when she thought I couldn't hear. After 43 years in this house, I knew every corner where sound carried, every spot where conversations echoed. The kitchen window had been my husband Robert's little joke. He'd positioned it perfectly so I could keep an eye on the garden while cooking. Now it was betraying secrets I never wanted to hear. "David, we need to talk about your mother." Jessica's voice was sweet but urgent.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
The way she talked when she was trying to convince him of something. She's getting older, and honestly, she's becoming a liability. Yesterday, she forgot she already watered the front lawn and did it again. Mrs. Henderson next door mentioned it to me at the grocery store. I froze with the watering can in my hand. I hadn't forgotten anything. I'd watered the front lawn in the morning because it gets the most sun, and the back garden in the evening like I'd done for decades. But Jessica twisted everything to fit her narrative. "Mom's fine, Jess. She's always been sharp as a tack." David's voice sounded tired. Like this wasn't their first conversation about me. "Is she, though? Last week she couldn't remember where she put her reading glasses, and they were on her head the whole time. And what about when she got confused about which day her doctor's appointment was?" My chest tightened. Those weren't signs of confusion. They were normal things that happen to everyone. But Jessica collected these tiny, meaningless moments like evidence in a case she was building against me. "Look, David, I love your mother. You know I do. But we need to be realistic here. She's old and, let's face it, becoming useless around the house. She can't help with the heavy cleaning anymore. She naps every afternoon, and yesterday I found her talking to herself in the garden." I wasn't talking to myself. I was talking to Robert's roses, telling him about my day like I'd done every morning since he passed 3 years ago. It brought me comfort. But Jessica turned even my grief into evidence of my deteriorating mind. "What are you suggesting?" David asked, and I could hear the resignation in his voice. "I'm suggesting we need to think about the future. This house is huge, and the property taxes alone are eating up her savings. If we're smart about this, we can help her while helping ourselves. You just need to convince her to change the title of the house to your name, for tax purposes. You understand. Protection against inheritance taxes when the time comes. She trusts you completely, so it'll be easy." The words hit me like ice water. She wanted my house. The house Robert and I had built together, where we'd raised David, where every room held 43 years of memories. The house where I'd planned to live out the rest of my days, surrounded by the life we'd created. I don't know, Jess. It feels wrong, talking about inheritance while she's still healthy. David, be practical. She's 69 years old. How many good years does she really have left? And honestly, she's becoming dead weight. She doesn't contribute to the household expenses anymore since her Social Security barely covers her personal needs. We're essentially supporting her, and it's not fair to Emma and the baby on the way. Dead weight. The phrase cut through me like a blade. This woman, whom I'd welcomed into my family, whom I'd helped through her difficult pregnancy with Emma, whom I'd supported when she was struggling with postpartum depression, she saw me as dead weight. "The house is worth at least $400,000 now," Jessica continued, her voice taking on that calculating tone she used when talking about money. "If we can get the title transferred to you, then eventually when she passes or needs to go into care, we can sell it and use the money for our family's future. Think about Emma's college fund. Think about the new baby coming." I sank onto the wooden bench Robert had built under the kitchen window, my legs suddenly unable to support me. She wasn't just planning to take my house. She was planning my entire future without consulting me. In her mind, I was already gone, just a problem to be managed and eventually disposed of. "She trusts you completely," Jessica repeated. "You just need to explain it as protecting her assets. Tell her it's smart financial planning. Old people love feeling like they're being responsible and forward-thinking. Old people. As if I weren't a person with my own thoughts and feelings, just a category to be managed. And then what? David asked quietly. Then we have options. If she becomes too much of a burden, there are some really nice senior communities around here. Places where she'd have people her own age, activities, medical care when she needs it. She'd probably be happier there anyway, instead of rattling around in this big house all alone. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. This was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep, whose fever I'd monitored through countless nights, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose dreams I'd supported even when money was tight, and he was sitting there listening to his wife plan my exile from my own home. "I suppose it makes sense," David said finally, and those words shattered something inside me that I knew would never heal. But we'd have to be careful about how we approach it. Mom's not stupid. No, but she's sentimental and trusting, especially with you. Just frame it as protecting her, protecting the family legacy. Tell her you want to make sure the house stays in the family forever. Appeal to her emotions, not her logic. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking as I set down the watering can. The roses I'd been tending, Robert's roses, the ones he'd planted for our 20th anniversary, seemed to shimmer through my tears. Everything I'd built, everything I'd treasured, was being plotted away by the very people who were supposed to love and protect me. "We should wait until after our trip to Rome, though," Jessica added. "I don't want anything to stress me out before we go. When we get back, relaxed and refreshed, we can have that conversation with her. Maybe bring her some nice gifts. Soften her up first. Rome. The trip I was paying for with the money I'd saved from my grocery budget, because Jessica had mentioned how stressed David looked, and how they needed time together before the new baby arrived. The money I'd given them because I wanted my family to be happy. As their voices faded and they moved to another part of the house, I remained on the bench, staring at the garden that had been my sanctuary for so many years. The late morning sun felt warm on my face, but inside I was cold, colder than I'd ever been. Even during those first months after Robert died. For 69 years, I'd tried to be a good person, a good wife, a good mother, a good neighbor. I'd trusted people, helped them, put their needs before my own. And this was where it had gotten me, sitting in my own garden, listening to my own family plan my disposal like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. But as I sat there, something else began to grow alongside the hurt and betrayal, something harder, more determined. They thought I was old and useless, dead weight to be managed and eventually discarded. They thought I was sentimental and trusting, easy to manipulate. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. Chapter 2. The signs I ignored. The sleepless nights that followed Jessica's whispered betrayal brought back memories I'd buried deep in my mind. Lying in the bed I'd shared with Robert for 38 years, staring at the ceiling he'd painted sky blue, because I'd mentioned liking the color, I began to see the pattern I'd been blind to for so long. Jessica hadn't arrived in our family as the calculating woman I'd overheard in the kitchen. She'd come as David's shy, sweet girlfriend, nervous about meeting his mother, clutching a homemade apple pie that was slightly burned around the edges. I'd found her endearing, this young woman who was trying so hard to impress me. "I hope you don't mind that I didn't use your recipe," she'd said that first Sunday dinner, fidgeting with her napkin. "David mentioned you make the best apple pie in the county, and I was too intimidated to even try copying it." I'd been charmed by her humility, her obvious adoration for my son. When she asked for my recipe the following week, I'd felt the warm glow of being needed, of having my experience valued. I'd spent an entire afternoon teaching her my grandmother's technique for the perfect crust, watching her take careful notes in her neat handwriting. But now, in the harsh clarity of betrayal, I could see how that first request had been a test, how my willingness to share, to include her, had been catalogued as weakness she could exploit. The changes had been so gradual, so subtle, that I'd convinced myself I was imagining things. It started with small corrections during family conversations. "Actually, Mrs. Patterson, I think David's soccer championship was in 7th grade, not 8th, she'd say with a gentle smile. "I asked him about it last week because I was making a scrapbook." I'd doubt myself then, wondering if my memory was failing. The championship had been such a proud moment. I'd sewn his jersey number onto a throw pillow that still sat on my couch. But Jessica's certainty made me question what I knew to be true. Then came the suggestions about my confusion. She'd mentioned them casually, almost offhandedly, but always in front of other people. "Oh, David's mom is so sweet, but she gets a little mixed up sometimes," she'd tell the neighbors when I'd mention the weather forecast being different from what she'd heard. "It happens to all of us as we get older, doesn't it?" The neighbors would nod sympathetically, and I'd feel a flush of embarrassment even though I knew I was right. I'd started checking and double-checking everything, second-guessing myself constantly. Jessica had been particularly clever about isolating me from my friends. She never forbade anything directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she'd create scheduling conflicts. "Oh, Mrs. Patterson, I hate to ask, but could you babysit Emma tonight? I know it's your book club night, but David has this work dinner and I have that prenatal class. We're in such a bind." Her voice would be apologetic, stressed, making me feel guilty for even considering my own plans. I'd cancel book club, telling myself that family came first. When Margaret Henderson called to ask why I'd missed 3 meetings in a row, I'd made excuses about being busy, about family obligations. Eventually, she'd stopped calling. The same pattern repeated with my bridge group, my volunteer work at the library, my weekly coffee dates with old friends. There was always a family emergency, always a reason why I was needed at home. And I'd felt useful, important, needed. I hadn't realized I was being systematically cut off from everyone who might notice the changes happening to me. Jessica's campaign against my competency had been masterful in its subtlety. She'd rearrange things in my own kitchen, then express concern when I couldn't find them. "Mom Patterson, you seem to be having trouble remembering where things go," she'd say, her forehead creased with worry. "Maybe we should think about organizing things differently, making them easier for you to find." She'd move my reading glasses, then point out how I was always misplacing things. She'd change the thermostat settings, then mention to David how I seemed to be having trouble regulating the temperature. Each incident was small, meaningless on its own, but together they painted a picture of a woman losing her grip on her own life. The most insidious part was how she'd turned my strengths into weaknesses. My memory for family stories became living in the past. My careful attention to household routines became obsessive behavior. My love of gardening became inability to let go of physical tasks beyond my abilities. "I worry about her out there with those heavy watering cans," she'd tell David. "What if she falls? What if she overexerts herself? Maybe we should hire someone to help with the yard work." I'd insisted I was fine, that gardening was my joy, my connection to Robert and the life we'd built. But I could see the doubt in David's eyes, the way he'd started watching me for signs of the frailty Jessica insisted was there. The financial manipulation had been even smoother. It started with Jessica offering to help with my bills. "Mom Patterson, I know managing finances can be overwhelming as we get older. Why don't you let me take a look at your monthly expenses? Maybe I can help you find ways to save money." I'd been touched by her concern, grateful for her offer to help. I'd shown her my budget, my modest savings, my carefully tracked expenses. She'd praised my frugality, my responsible money management. But somehow, that information had become ammunition. "David, I'm worried about your mother's finances," I'd overheard her saying weeks later. "She's spending money on things she doesn't need, and her budget seems really tight. I think the stress of managing everything is getting to her." She'd started suggesting that I shouldn't worry about contributing to household expenses, that they could handle everything. It sounded generous, caring, but I realized now it was another way to make me dependent, to position me as a burden rather than a contributing member of the household. The pregnancy announcement had been Jessica's masterstroke. She'd waited until I was fully isolated, fully dependent on their version of reality, before revealing she was expecting their second child. "We're so excited, Mom Patterson," she'd said, her hand resting on her still flat belly. "But we're going to need to make some changes around here. The baby will need its own room, and with Emma getting bigger, We're going to need more space." She'd looked around my living room with calculating eyes, already rearranging my life to accommodate her growing family. That's when the hints about senior communities had started. "I saw the most beautiful assisted living place the other day," she'd mentioned casually while folding laundry. "They have their own gardens, organized activities, people your own age to socialize with. It looked so peaceful, so worry-free." When I'd responded with horror at the suggestion, she'd backtracked quickly. "Oh, I didn't mean now, Mom Patterson. Just someday, when you're ready for that kind of community living. Some people find it liberating, not having to worry about maintaining a big house." But the seed had been planted. She'd begun a steady campaign of pointing out the house's maintenance needs, the rising property taxes, the burden of home ownership for someone my age. She'd made it sound like she was concerned for my well-being, when really she was preparing me to see giving up my home as a relief rather than a loss. The most painful realization was how she'd used my love for David against me. Every time I'd started to push back, to assert myself, she'd find a way to make it about his happiness. "I just want David to be happy," she'd say, tears in her eyes. "He works so hard and he worries about you constantly. Sometimes I think he'd be less stressed if he knew you were being taken care of properly." She'd made my independence seem selfish, made my desire to stay in my own home appear like stubbornness that was hurting my son. And because I loved David more than anything in the world, I'd started to doubt my own instincts, my own needs. Now, lying in the darkness of my bedroom, I could see the full scope of her manipulation. She'd spent 3 years systematically dismantling my confidence, my relationships, my sense of self-worth. She'd positioned herself as the caring daughter-in-law while painting me as the confused, burdensome mother-in-law who needed to be managed. And David, my precious son whom I'd raised to see the best in people, had believed every word of it. The most devastating part wasn't even Jessica's betrayal. It was David's willingness to go along with it. The boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried when he accidentally stepped on a butterfly, who'd promised to take care of me when I was old. That boy had grown into a man who could sit quietly while his wife planned to steal his mother's home. But as dawn broke through my bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors Robert had refinished with his own hands, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt was still there, raw and deep. But alongside it was something harder, more determined. They thought they knew me. They thought I was weak, confused, easy to manipulate. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. 3 days after I'd overheard Jessica's whispered betrayal, she announced their second honeymoon with the theatrical enthusiasm she brought to all her performances. "David, I have the most wonderful surprise," she exclaimed over breakfast, practically bouncing in her chair. "I've been planning something special for months, and I finally have all the details worked out." I was buttering my toast at the kitchen counter, pretending to be absorbed in the simple task while watching their reflection in the chrome surface of the coffee maker. David looked up from his phone with the weary expression he'd been wearing more often lately. "What kind of surprise, Jess?" "A trip to Rome. 3 whole weeks in Italy, just the 2 of us. We can visit the Colosseum, the Vatican, those little restaurants you see in movies. It'll be like a second honeymoon before the baby comes and we get too busy to travel." David's face lit up for the first time in weeks. "Rome? Seriously? But how can we afford—" "That's the best part," Jessica interrupted, her eyes sparkling with practiced innocence. "Your mother offered to help. She said she wanted to do something special for us before the baby arrives." I nearly dropped my butter knife. I had done no such thing. But before I could speak, Jessica continued, "Weren't you sweet, Mom Patterson? When I mentioned how stressed David's been at work, you immediately suggested we take a real vacation. You said you'd been saving money from your grocery budget specifically for family emergencies, and this qualified." The lie was so smooth, so believable, that for a moment I wondered if I was losing my memory after all. But I knew exactly where my grocery money was. In the ceramic jar shaped like a rooster that Robert had bought me for our 10th anniversary. I'd been putting aside $20 a week for over a year, money I'd saved by buying generic brands and cooking simpler meals. "Mom, you don't have to do that," David said. But I could hear the longing in his voice. He'd been working 60-hour weeks at the engineering firm, trying to get promoted before the baby arrived. "Of course I do," I heard myself saying. the words coming out automatically. "You work so hard, honey. You deserve a break." Jessica beamed at me with what looked like genuine affection. "You're the most generous person I know, Mom Patterson. David is so lucky to have a mother who cares this much about his happiness." The manipulation was flawless. She'd backed me into a corner where refusing would make me look selfish, uncaring toward my own son, and she'd done it in front of David, making me complicit in her lie. "When would you go?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Next month," Jessica said quickly. "I've already looked at flights and hotels. 3 weeks should give us enough time to really relax and reconnect before life gets crazy with 2 kids." 3 weeks. Long enough for me to be completely alone in the house, with no witnesses to whatever they had planned for their return. That evening, after they'd gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with the ceramic rooster jar in front of me. Inside were 43 $20 bills, $860 I'd saved by eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch and walking to the grocery store instead of driving to save gas money. I thought about my husband, Robert, how proud he'd been of my frugality, my ability to stretch $1. "You're the smartest woman I know, Irene," he used to say. "You can make a feast out of nothing and save money while doing it." Now that careful saving was funding a trip that would somehow be used against me. Over the next few days, I watched Jessica orchestrate the details with military precision. She booked flights, reserved hotels, researched restaurants. But she also did something else. She began preparing me for their absence with little comments and suggestions that seemed caring but felt ominous. "Mom Patterson, we hate leaving you alone for so long," she said while packing their suitcases. "Promise me you won't try to do too much while we're gone. No heavy cleaning, no yard work. Just relax and take care of yourself." She'd arranged for Mrs. Henderson from next door to check on me daily, framing it as neighborly concern, but making it sound like I needed supervision. "I've asked her to just pop by and make sure you're okay," Jessica explained. "At your age, anything could happen. A fall, a medical emergency. We'd never forgive ourselves if something happened while we were away." At my age, 69 wasn't ancient, but Jessica had a way of making it sound like I was teetering on the edge of incapacity. The real preparation became clear when I found the papers. It was Tuesday afternoon, 5 days before their departure. Jessica had taken Emma to a doctor's appointment, and David was at work. I was dusting the living room when I knocked over a stack of magazines on the side table. As I bent to pick them up, several documents slipped from between the pages of Better Homes and Gardens. My hand shook as I read the first page. Property transfer for tax avoidance and asset protection. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. They were planning to have me sign over the deed to my house, transferring ownership to David while I retained some kind of life estate that would allow me to live here until I died or became incapacitated. The second document was even more chilling. Power of attorney for financial and healthcare decisions. If I signed it, David would have complete control over my money, my medical care, my life. The paper explained that this was standard protection for aging parents and would ensure proper care and financial management. There were sticky notes in Jessica's handwriting marking where I should sign, with little arrows and notes like, "Mom, sign here," and "For your protection, don't forget to initial." But it was the third document that made my blood run cold. It was a brochure for Sunset Manor, a premier assisted living community about 40 minutes away. Someone had circled several amenities in red ink: 24-hour medical care, medication management, memory care services. In the margins, Jessica had written notes: spacious private rooms, all meals included, perfect for Mom P. My legs gave out, and I sank into Robert's old recliner, the papers scattered across my lap. This was their plan. They would return from Rome, relaxed and happy, bearing expensive gifts and stories of their romantic adventure. Then they would sit me down for what Jessica would frame as a caring family discussion about my future. She would express concern about my living alone in such a big house. David would mention the financial burden of maintaining the property at my age. They would present the power of attorney as a way to help me manage my affairs, the property transfer as smart estate planning that would save taxes and keep the house in the family. And when I resisted, when I asked questions or expressed doubt, Jessica would point to my confusion, my memory problems, my increasing inability to handle complex decisions. She would have Mrs. Henderson as a witness to my declining state during their absence. She might even suggest that the stress of their trip had accelerated my mental deterioration. The assisted living brochure would be presented as a caring solution. Just until you feel more confident managing on your own, Jessica would say. It's not permanent, just a safe place where you can get the help you need. But I knew better. Once I signed those papers, once I moved to Sunset Manor, I would never come home again. The house Robert and I had built, where we'd raised our son, where I'd planned to spend my final years surrounded by 4 decades of memories. It would become David and Jessica's house. I would become a visitor in my own life. I thought about the timing of their trip. 3 weeks in Rome while I stayed home alone, supposedly proving I couldn't manage without them. Mrs. Henderson would dutifully report any small incident, a grocery delivery, a minor stumble in the garden, a day when I didn't feel like getting dressed. Jessica would return with a mental list of my incidents that proved I needed supervision. The cruelest part was how they would frame it as love. Jessica would cry as she explained how worried they'd been about me. David would hold my hand and tell me they only wanted what was best for me. They would make me feel guilty for resisting their help, selfish for wanting to stay in my own home. I sat in that chair for over an hour, holding the papers that represented the theft of my entire life. Outside, the late afternoon sun was setting behind the oak tree Robert had planted when David was born. In 3 weeks, when David and Jessica returned from their Italian adventure, they would expect to find me weakened, isolated, ready to accept their solution to the problem of my independence. But as darkness fell around me, I realized something they hadn't counted on. For the first time in 3 years, I would be completely alone in my own house. No Jessica watching my every move, cataloging my mistakes. No David looking at me with the mixture of love and pity she'd taught him to feel. For 3 weeks, I would be free to think clearly, to plan, to act without their influence or manipulation. They thought they were leaving me here to deteriorate in isolation, to become so desperate for human contact that I'd gratefully accept their conditions for returning. Instead, they were giving me the greatest gift possible, time and space to save myself. I carefully tucked the papers back between the magazine pages, leaving everything exactly as I'd found it. When Jessica returned from Emma's appointment, I was in the kitchen starting dinner, humming softly to myself. "You seem cheerful tonight, Mom Patterson," she observed, hanging her purse on the hook by the door. "I am," I replied, stirring the pot of soup that had been Robert's favorite. "I'm looking forward to having some quiet time while you're away. It'll give me a chance to think about the future." Jessica smiled, clearly pleased by what she interpreted as acceptance of my declining circumstances. "I'm so glad you see it that way. Sometimes a little solitude helps us gain perspective on what's really important." She had no idea how right she was. The house felt different the moment David's car disappeared around the corner, heading for the airport. For the first time in 3 years, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was liberating. I stood at the living room window, watching their taillights fade into the morning traffic, and felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert died. Complete ownership of my own space. Jessica had left me with a list of instructions typed in her neat, controlling handwriting. Emergency contacts, daily routine suggestions, important reminders. Reading it felt like receiving orders from a commanding officer who expected unquestioning obedience. "Please remember to eat regular meals, Mom Patterson. We've stocked the freezer with easy-to-prepare options. Mrs. Henderson will check on you daily at 10 a.m. Please be sure to answer the door so she doesn't worry. If you need anything, call David's cell phone, though remember there's a 6-hour time difference. Try not to disturb us unless it's truly urgent." The condescension in every line made my jaw clench. But underneath my anger was something more powerful: clarity. For the first time in years, I could think without Jessica's voice in my head, questioning my judgment, undermining my confidence. I crumpled up her list and threw it in the kitchen trash can. Then I made myself a real breakfast. Not the bland oatmeal Jessica insisted was better for my digestion, but eggs Benedict with hollandaise sauce, the way Robert used to make it on Sunday mornings. I ate it at the dining room table using our wedding china, savoring every bite while making my own list. The first call I made was to Tom Richardson, a real estate agent who'd been trying to buy houses in our neighborhood for years. I'd met him at the grocery store just last month, when he'd struck up a conversation about the beautiful old homes on my street. "Mrs. Patterson," he'd said, loading his cart with what looked like groceries for a family of 6, "if you ever decide to downsize, please give me a call first. I have investors who are specifically looking for houses like yours. The character, the established gardens, the solid construction, they don't build them like that anymore." He'd handed me his business card, which I'd politely tucked into my purse and forgotten about. Now I dug it out from the kitchen drawer where I kept miscellaneous papers. "Tom Richardson Real Estate," he answered on the second ring. "Mr. Richardson, this is Irene Patterson. We met at the grocery store last month. You mentioned having investors interested in houses on Maple Avenue." "Mrs. Patterson? Of course, yes. The beautiful colonial with the rose garden. Are you thinking about making a change?" I took a deep breath. "I am. I need to sell quickly, and I understand you work with cash buyers." There was a pause, then excitement in his voice. "I do indeed. Would you be available for me to take a look this afternoon? I have a client who's been specifically looking for a property in your area. This afternoon would be perfect." After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out at the garden Robert and I had planted together. The roses were in full bloom, their scent drifting through the open window. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I really going to sell the house where I'd lived for 43 years? The house where David had taken his first steps? Where Robert had died peacefully in our bed upstairs? But then I remembered the papers hidden in Jessica's magazine, the casual way she'd discussed my future as if I were already gone. I thought about David's willingness to listen to her plans without defending me. His mother who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. This house had been my sanctuary, but Jessica had poisoned it. She'd turned it into a trap, a place where I was watched and judged and found wanting every single day. If I stayed, if I allowed them to execute their plan, I would spend my remaining years as a prisoner in my own home before being shipped off to die among strangers. Tom Richardson arrived at 2 o'clock sharp, a tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He walked through my house with obvious appreciation, running his hands along the crown molding Robert had installed himself, admiring the hardwood floors we'd refinished together. "This is exactly what my client is looking for," he said as we finished the tour in the kitchen. "Original character, well-maintained, established neighborhood. The garden alone is worth a fortune. Those roses must be decades old. My husband planted them for our 20th anniversary," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Mrs. Patterson, I have to ask, are you sure about this decision? It's a significant step, selling a family home." I looked out at those roses, at the swing Robert had hung from the oak tree for David, at the vegetable garden where I'd taught my son to plant tomatoes. Then I thought about Jessica's whispered words. "She's old and useless." "I'm very sure," I said firmly. "How quickly can this happen?" "With a cash buyer, we could close in 10 days. Maybe less if you're flexible on the terms." 10 days. David and Jessica would still be in Rome, posting pictures of pasta and wine on social media, believing they had 2 more weeks to set their trap. "What kind of price are we talking about?" I asked. Tom pulled out his phone and showed me comparable sales in the neighborhood. The numbers made my eyes widen. The house was worth significantly more than the $400,000 Jessica had mentioned to David. "Based on recent sales and the condition of your property, I'd estimate $520,000, possibly more. But for a quick cash sale, my client would probably offer around $475,000. No inspections, no financing contingencies, no complications. $475,000. More money than Robert and I had ever dreamed of having. Enough to buy a small house somewhere else, somewhere Jessica had never been, and still have plenty left over for whatever years remained to me. "Let's do it," I said. Tom shook my hand, grinning. "I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. My client will want to see it first, but based on what I've told him, I'm confident we can have an offer by tomorrow afternoon." After he left, I walked through my house with new eyes. These weren't just the rooms where I'd lived my life. They were assets that could buy me freedom. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals became square footage with updated appliances. The living room where we'd watched David grow up became original hardwood floors and period details. I spent the evening going through my belongings, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. The photo albums would come with me, along with Robert's books and my grandmother's china. The furniture could stay. Let David and Jessica return to find their inheritance already furnished. Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door at exactly 10 the next morning, just as Jessica had arranged. "Good morning, Irene," she said, peering at me with obvious concern. "How are you managing on your own?" "Wonderfully," I replied, perhaps too cheerfully. "I'm actually enjoying the peace and quiet." She looked disappointed, as if she'd been hoping to find me in some state of distress that she could report back to Jessica. "Well, if you need anything at all, just holler. Jessica made me promise to keep a close eye on you. That's very kind, but completely unnecessary. I'm quite capable of taking care of myself." As she walked back to her house, I could see her confusion. She'd clearly been briefed to expect a helpless old woman, not someone who seemed perfectly competent and content. Tom called that afternoon with good news. His client had driven by the house and was prepared to make an offer of $480,000, with closing in 8 days. "He loves the neighborhood," Tom explained. "He's actually been waiting for something like this to come on the market. We can have all the paperwork signed by Friday." Friday. David and Jessica would still be having romantic dinners in Italian restaurants, completely unaware that their carefully laid plans were crumbling back home. "There's one condition," I told Tom. "I need the buyer to be flexible about possession. I might need an extra week or two to arrange my next steps. I'm sure that won't be a problem for a cash deal. When do you think you'd be ready to move?" I calculated quickly. David and Jessica would return on a Tuesday. If I could time everything right, they could come home to find the house sold and me already gone. Clean, simple, final. 3 weeks from today, I said. I'll be ready to hand over the keys 3 weeks from today. That evening, I sat in Robert's chair with a glass of his favorite wine, toasting my empty house and my uncertain but suddenly hopeful future. For the first time since his death, I felt like I was taking control of my own destiny instead of letting others decide what was best for me. Jessica called the next morning from Rome, her voice bubbling with artificial concern. "Mom Patterson, how are you doing, sweetie? We've been thinking about you so much. David was worried you might be lonely." "I'm doing beautifully," I said, watching through the window as a surveyor measured my property lines. "Actually, I've been quite productive, getting some things organized, making some plans for the future." "Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you're keeping busy. We can't wait to come home and hear all about what you've been up to." If only she knew. "Are you having a lovely time?" I asked sweetly. "Oh yes, it's absolutely magical. The food, the history, the romance, it's everything I dreamed it would be. Thank you again for making this possible. You're the most generous mother-in-law in the world, the most generous, and soon to be the most absent." After I hung up, I looked around the house that would no longer be mine in less than a week. I felt no sadness, only a fierce satisfaction. They thought they were so clever, manipulating me with such care and patience. They had no idea that their perfect plan was about to become their perfect nightmare. I had 6 more days to prepare for the most important performance of my life. The house sale closed on Thursday morning. I signed my name 47 times, each signature feeling like a small act of rebellion. When the lawyer handed me the cashier's check for $480,000, my hands didn't shake. I felt completely certain for the first time in years. David and Jessica weren't due home until Tuesday, giving me 5 days to complete my preparations. I'd been living like a secret agent, maintaining the illusion of normalcy while systematically dismantling my old life. Mrs. Henderson had been my unwitting ally, reporting to Jessica that I seemed surprisingly well. I'd made sure to be visible in my garden each morning, waving cheerfully while tending roses that would soon belong to strangers. The hardest part was packing Robert's things. His clothes, books, fishing lures organized with such care. I couldn't take everything to my new cottage at Sunrise Gardens, so I chose items with the strongest memories. His favorite sweater, the wooden box with his father's watch, our early photo albums. I left Jessica's hidden papers exactly where I'd found them, tucked in better homes and gardens. Let her discover her careful plans were now meaningless. Tuesday morning dawned clear and warm. I dressed in my best summer dress, the blue one Robert had loved, and spent extra time on my hair and makeup. If this was my final performance in this house, I wanted to look my absolute best. At noon, I called the moving company. The U-Haul arrived 30 minutes later with 3 cheerful men who loaded my boxes and furniture. Everything was going directly to cottage number 7 at Sunrise Gardens, where I'd already paid first month's rent. At 2:45 p.m., I heard a car door slam. My heart beat faster, but with anticipation, not fear. I positioned myself on the front porch swing with tea and a book. David struggled with luggage while Jessica stretched, looking satisfied like someone returning to their rightful domain. They looked tan and relaxed, carrying expensive shopping bags bought with my grocery money. Jessica wore a new Italian dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. "Mom!" David called, waving. "We're home!" I waved back, smiling serenely. "Welcome back, sweetheart. Did you have a wonderful time?" Jessica bounced up the steps, arms full of packages. "Oh, Mom Patterson, it was absolutely magical. The food, the art, the history, everything was more beautiful than we imagined." She hugged me enthusiastically. I hugged back, marveling at her ability to seem genuinely affectionate when I knew what she'd been planning. "I'm so glad you enjoyed it," I said calmly. David joined us, looking happier than I'd seen him in months. "Mom, thank you for making this possible. I know it was a sacrifice, and it meant everything to us." "It wasn't a sacrifice at all," I replied, which was now completely true. Jessica launched into detailed accounts of their adventures, showing hundreds of photos. "And tomorrow, we want to sit down and talk about some ideas we've been discussing. Ways to make your life easier and more secure. We have suggestions we think you'll really appreciate." "How thoughtful," I said mildly. "But tomorrow won't work for me." They looked surprised. Jessica's enthusiasm faltered. "Oh? Do you have plans?" Before I could answer, another car pulled into the driveway. Then another. David and Jessica turned as doors opened. Strangers with clipboards, measuring tapes, a woman in a business suit with a camera, a man with a toolkit. "Mom," David said slowly, confusion in his voice. "Who are these people?" I stood from the porch swing smoothing my dress. "The new owners, I believe, and their contractors. They want to start planning renovations right away." Complete silence. Jessica's face went through confusion, disbelief, dawning horror, and finally rage. "New owners?" David's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes," I said pleasantly. "I sold the house while you were away. The closing was Thursday. They're taking possession this afternoon." Jessica's shopping bags crashed to the porch floor, expensive souvenirs scattering. "You did what?" "I sold the house," I repeated steadily, "for $480,000. Quite a bit more than the $400,000 you mentioned to David before you left." David's face went white. "Mom, you can't have sold the house. It's been in our family for decades. This is where I grew up, where Dad died, where we were going to raise our children." "Funny," I said, walking toward the strangers examining my former flower beds. "That's not what I heard you and Jessica discussing in the kitchen 3 weeks ago." Jessica found her voice, shrill with panic. "David, she's having some kind of episode. Old people do this. They make irrational decisions when confused or scared. This can't be legal. We need to call a lawyer." I turned back to face them. "There's nothing to fix, Jessica. I'm 69, not 99. I'm of completely sound mind, as the lawyers will attest. I made this decision after overhearing your chat about how old and useless I am." David's mouth opened and closed. Jessica's face flushed red with fury. "Where are you going to live?" David finally asked. I smiled, the same patient, loving, but authoritative smile I'd given him as a child. "Somewhere you'll never find me unless I want you to. Somewhere I can spend my remaining years without being watched and judged. Somewhere people value wisdom instead of youth." The new owners approached, led by Tom Richardson, grinning at the scene. "Mrs. Patterson?" he called cheerfully. "Ready to hand over the keys?" I pulled out the keyring I'd held for 43 years. Behind me, Jessica's voice rose hysterically. "David, do something. Stop her. This is our house, our future, our children's inheritance." But David just stood there, finally understanding his mother wasn't the confused old woman he'd been taught to see. I handed Tom the keys and shook his hand. "Thank you for everything." Walking toward my car with my remaining possessions in the back seat, I heard David call out, "Mom, where are you going? How will we find you?" I paused with my hand on the car door, looking back at my son and the woman who'd poisoned him against me. "You won't," I said simply. "That's the point." 6 months later, I was watering the roses in my cottage garden when I heard familiar laughter drifting from the community center. It was Tuesday afternoon, which meant the book club was discussing this month's selection, a mystery novel that had kept us all guessing until the final pages. The sound made me smile, reminding me how much my life had changed since that devastating day when I'd overheard Jessica's whispered betrayal. Cottage number 7 at Sunrise Gardens had become more than just a new address. It had become my sanctuary. The 2-bedroom home was smaller than the house I'd shared with Robert, but every square inch belonged entirely to me. No one questioned my decorating choices, criticized my cooking, or suggested I was too old to manage my own affairs. My living room faced the community pond, where I'd taken to having my morning coffee while watching ducks paddle across the water. Robert's favorite chair sat by the window, his fishing magazines still stacked on the side table. His presence felt stronger here somehow, as if moving away from the toxicity of my final years on Maple Avenue had allowed his memory to breathe again. The cottage's 2nd bedroom had become my art studio, something I'd never had space for in my old house. I'd always loved painting, but had given it up when Jessica moved in, claiming the smell of oils gave her headaches. Now watercolor landscapes covered my walls, scenes of the pond at sunrise, the walking trails that wound through the community, portraits of my new neighbors who'd become genuine friends. Eleanor Hartwell lived in Cottage Thupwood 12 and had become my closest companion. At 74, she was a retired librarian with a sharp wit and endless stories about the decades she'd spent helping people find exactly the books they needed. Unlike Jessica, Eleanor never corrected my memories or suggested I was confused. When I told her about Robert's roses or David's childhood, she listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she valued my experiences. "You know what I love about getting older?" Eleanor had said during one of our evening walks around the pond. "I finally stopped caring what people think about me. It's the most liberating feeling in the world." She was right. For the first time in years, I woke up each morning without anxiety about whether I'd meet someone else's expectations. I ate what I wanted, watched the television shows I enjoyed, wore clothes that made me happy instead of trying to look appropriate for my age. The financial freedom from selling the house had given me options I'd never imagined. After buying my cottage and putting money aside for future care needs, I still had enough to live comfortably without worrying about every expense. I could afford to eat out occasionally, buy books without checking prices, even take the weekend trips that Eleanor and I had started planning. But the greatest gift wasn't the money. It was the discovery that I could make new friends, create new routines, build a life that had nothing to do with who I'd been as Robert's wife or David's mother. Here, I was simply Irene Patterson, a woman with her own interests, opinions, and value. The book club had been Eleanor's suggestion, but I'd found my own place in the community garden committee, helping newer residents learn which flowers thrived in our climate. Teaching others felt natural, rewarding in a way that being constantly taught and corrected by Jessica never had. My phone rarely rang anymore, which was exactly how I preferred it. I'd gotten a new number when I moved, giving it only to Eleanor and a few other close friends I'd made at Sunrise Gardens. The silence where David's calls used to be had hurt initially, but now it felt peaceful. I no longer jumped every time the phone buzzed, wondering what crisis or criticism awaited me. That afternoon, as I finished watering my roses, Mrs. Chen from Cottage number 9 waved from her garden. "Irene, are you coming to the potluck dinner tonight? I'm making my famous dumplings." "I wouldn't miss it," I called back, genuinely looking forward to the evening. Community dinners at Sunrise Gardens were nothing like the tense family meals I'd endured with Jessica, watching my every bite, commenting on my portions or suggesting healthier alternatives. Here, food was about pleasure and sharing. People brought dishes they were proud of, recipes passed down through generations or discovered in their travels. No one counted calories or made passive-aggressive comments about anyone's choices. We ate, laughed, told stories, and celebrated the simple joy of good food shared with people who chose to be together. As I prepared for the potluck, I thought about the contrast between my old life and my new one. Jessica had spent years convincing me that I was becoming a burden, that my needs and preferences were inconvenient obstacles to her family's happiness. Here, my neighbors valued my contributions. They asked for my advice about gardening, appreciated my homemade cookies, invited me to join their activities not out of obligation, but because they genuinely enjoyed my company. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. The first few weeks at Sunrise Gardens, I'd been cautious, almost suspicious of kindness, after years of having my every gesture analyzed for signs of incompetence. When Eleanor complimented my cooking or Mrs. Chen asked to borrow a book, I'd wondered what they really wanted, what favor they were building up to request. But gradually, I'd begun to trust that these relationships were different. These people had no agenda beyond friendship. They weren't trying to manage me, change me, or prepare me for some future they'd decided was inevitable. They simply liked spending time with me, valued my company, respected my autonomy. The potluck dinner was held in the community center's main room, round tables covered with cheerful tablecloths and decorated with flowers from our various gardens. About 30 residents attended, ranging in age from their early 60s to well into their 80s. What struck me most was how alive everyone seemed, engaged, curious, still growing and learning despite what the outside world might assume about people our age. "Irene," called out Frank Morrison, a retired engineer who'd become our unofficial community historian. "Come sit with us. Eleanor saved you a spot." I joined their table, where conversation flowed easily between topics as diverse as current events, travel experiences, grandchildren's achievements, and book recommendations. No one spoke to me in the patronizing tone I'd grown accustomed to from Jessica. No one questioned my memory or suggested I was confused when I shared an opinion that differed from theirs. During dessert, Eleanor leaned over and whispered, "You look happier every time I see you. Moving here was the best decision you ever made." She was right, though it had taken months for me to fully believe it. I'd spent so many years being told I was declining, becoming a burden, losing my ability to make good decisions, that I'd almost believed it myself. Living independently, managing my own affairs, maintaining friendships based on mutual respect and genuine affection, it had all seemed impossible when I was trapped in Jessica's carefully constructed narrative of my incompetence. After dinner, several of us lingered on the community center's porch, watching fireflies dance over the pond as evening settled around us. The conversation turned to children and grandchildren, as it often did among people our age. "My daughter keeps insisting I should move closer to her," Mrs. Patterson from Cottage Thumyer 15 was saying. "She thinks I'm too isolated here, that I need more family involvement in my daily life. But honestly, I've never been happier. I love having my own space, my own schedule, friends who choose to spend time with me." Several others nodded in understanding. It seemed many of us had family members who struggled to accept that we were thriving in our independence, rather than merely surviving until they could take over our care. "My son hasn't called in 3 months, I found myself saying. For a while, that hurt, but now I realize those calls were never really about wanting to talk to me. They were about checking up on me, monitoring my condition, gathering evidence of my decline. I don't miss that kind of attention." Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Their loss," she said firmly. "We're not museum pieces to be preserved or problems to be solved. We're living, growing people with our own dreams and plans." As the evening wound down and residents began drifting back to their cottages, I felt the deep contentment that had become my normal state of being. No anxiety about whether I'd said something wrong, no dread about tomorrow's potential criticisms or manipulations, just the peaceful satisfaction of a day well lived among people who valued me exactly as I was. Back in my cottage, I settled into Robert's chair with a cup of tea and the mystery novel we'd be discussing at next week's book club. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the oppressive silence of isolation. It was the comfortable quiet of solitude, chosen rather than imposed. My phone sat on the side table, silent as always. Sometimes I wondered what David and Jessica had done after discovering the house was sold. Whether they'd tried to track me down, whether they'd learned anything from the experience. But these thoughts came less frequently now, and with less pain when they did surface. I'd built a new life that had nothing to do with them, nothing to do with the woman I'd been when I was trapped in their web of manipulation and control. Here at Sunrise Gardens, I wasn't the confused old woman Jessica had painted me to be, or the burden David had learned to see me as. I was simply Irene, a woman with her own interests, friendships, and future. The roses Robert had planted were long gone, now blooming in someone else's garden, but the ones I'd planted outside my cottage window were thriving, their roots growing deeper each season in soil that truly belonged to me. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same silver hair, the same lined face, the same 69-year-old body, but her eyes were different, clearer, more confident, free from the constant worry that had shadowed them for so many years. I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who saw me as I truly was, rather than who they needed me to be. And for the first time since Robert's death, I looked forward to tomorrow, to the weeks and months and years ahead, knowing they would be filled with choices I made for myself, relationships I chose to nurture, and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived entirely on my own terms. The old Irene might have wondered if this happiness was selfish, if I should feel guilty for choosing my own well-being over my family's expectations. But the woman I'd become understood something Jessica had never grasped. True love doesn't require you to disappear.